This is a panel that I myself and many others in the centre and in the field have been looking forward to for quite some time. And it should build really nicely, I think, on the previous panel. We've got three giants with us that have each contributed tremendously to thinking and actually moving beyond GDP and putting well-being at the heart of policy. But I do feel that this is a unique opportunity also to dig a bit deeper about what we actually mean, more precisely so, with well-being, and what well-being or measures should be and can be the ultimate criterion to build policy on, the key performance indicator, if you will. Because that is ultimately what policymakers need. They need something to optimize on. And what measure of well-being or what measures of well-being is a deep and important debate. Paul and Richard have forcefully argued over the years, for many years now, for subjective well-being measures of the kind that we've been hearing a lot about already, whether they are effective or evaluative. But both have taken somewhat different takes on this aspect of to use effective or evaluative measures as the key criterion or the proper criterion to use for policy. Diane, I think, will help us take a step back and consider whether subjective well-being measures are up to the job in the first place, perhaps, or whether a multidimensional mix of indicators is potentially better. And so my hope is for this panel of grandees in the Beyond GDP movement to hopefully come to a very open, you too, Paul, to have an open, potentially critical, but constructively critical discussion around the use of specific measures to take us beyond GDP and measures that capture well-being properly, and how and which ones are best fit for purpose from a policymaker's perspective. I will start with Diane, who is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at Cambridge University, the other university, where she co-directs the Bennett Institute. Diane is a towering figure, as I said, in the Beyond GDP movement, and she, as you will all know, has written many books on the subject, probably the best books on the subject of both the shortcomings of GDP and what can be done to improve on it. She has also held a number of really important roles in policy, and I think that really makes Diane a person ideal to kick us off with, to talk about well-being and policy and what measures are the most user-friendly. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you for the introduction. I've never been called a grandee before, so that's great. And it's really wonderful to be here with so many friends and colleagues and old debating partners as well. So as Jan said, I came to this subject through the Beyond GDP debate, and it probably started in the early 2000s. Getting into that discussion about the limitations of GDP, which are very well known, and the consequent question, which is if that's limited as your metric of progress, then what is a better metric of progress? What should you be thinking about? And this came about, I think, partly because in the 1950s and the 60s and 70s, GDP was a much better proxy for economic welfare than it has become subsequently for all kinds of reasons. And so the debate is, as Gus said in his introduction, do you try to tweak GDP and make it better? It was always actually a semi-economic welfare measure, but it's got worse and worse, so can we improve it again? Do you think about a new single index? And some of those are very long-standing. The Human Development Index, for instance, is one, and there are newer ones, Happy Planet Index. Tobin and Nordhaus did one in the 1970s, measure of economic welfare. Or do you instead try to think about a dashboard of metrics? And if so, what should go into that dashboard? And the Sen, Stiglitz and Fitoussi Commission that was published in 2009 came down on the side of a dashboard. And there's probably been what I would call a proliferation of dashboards since then, culminating in the Sustainable Development Goals, which are all very worthy and the subject of a very intense debate about what should go in there. But they ended up with nearly 300 metrics and no framework for thinking about the trade-offs between them, still less actually measuring them across many different countries. So there's really a fundamental dilemma here. Do we want one number or do we want many numbers? And I've been very influenced by Amartya Sen's and Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach, which is multidimensional, that you can't compress all of the things that we care about into a single number. And in my policy roles as well, applying public value tests in the context of BBC services, that again, doesn't boil it down to a single number. It's a framework for making a judgment given a series of numbers and a series of indicators. But there is, I think, just a really fundamental dilemma that Elizabeth Anderson described very well in her book, Values in Ethics and Economics, which is that we know there are multiple dimensions that we care about, but when you're coming to policy choices, there's a choice. It's got to be a go or a no-go. And so how do we resolve this dilemma? And I see this playing out a little bit in wellbeing policy. In the previous panel, Liz was talking about the very welcome moves by ONS to publish environmental indicators and now wellbeing indicators alongside GDP numbers. And indeed, John Hicks used to call it the social framework. It wasn't GDP, it wasn't even national accounts, it was the social framework. So we think about that, but we've got to rely on some kind of reduction to actually make policy decisions. Given where I come from philosophically on this, I welcome the wellbeing agenda as a means of making policy less reductive and expanding that dimensionality and bringing back the role of judgment and normative criteria in thinking about economic policy decisions. But I think there are lots of questions, and especially outside a room like this where we are all talking to like-minded people. So Sarah talked about the Green Book driving demand for wellbeing evidence. It's driving demand because it's the Green Book. I think it's more that than a fundamental upsurge in interest in wellbeing evidence, although perhaps that's there too. But I think we've still got to answer some questions. And I just want to end, if I may, by flagging up what I think are some really important areas for both policymakers and researchers to take away to think about. One is the question about individual versus collective. Some colleagues of mine on a project that we did working with Nancy and her colleagues looked at the link between life satisfaction and education. And in the data set and for the period that we had the data, there was a negative correlation for individuals between life satisfaction and educational attainment, but a positive correlation between individual well-being and the a proportion of people with qualifications living in their area. So that's one example. I don't know if it's robust across different times and different places, but that question about individual versus collective seems to me to be one that needs exploring more. Gus talked about wellbeing mobility. There are lots of interesting questions, it seems to me, about the link between the econometric evidence that we have and underlying psychological theories and some hypothesis testing to be done so that we know whether in that database of coefficients we've got structural coefficients or reduced form coefficients. So how robust are they over time and across places? And I'm about to start with my colleague Gordon Harold in Cambridge, a big project looking at mental well-being in the workplace and how that is linked to individuals' transitions among their different jobs into the workplace in the first place, and how that relates to more conventional economic measures like productivity and profits. So we think there are lots of interesting questions there. And I'd also like to see more co-production. My former colleague Mark Fabian, who's here today, was the leader of a project co-producing well-being outcome measures for people who had fallen into poverty and approached a charity called Turn to Us. And I think the lesson I took from that was that the ONS4 are great, but in many contexts they don't give you the full picture. And let's think about some of the other indicators that might emerge from that kind of very bottom-up work, not focus groups, not surveys, but co-production. And in particular, that we've discussed the civil sector today, the third sector. I think there's a fourth sector, and that's what happens inside households and household production and children, which came up in the last section too. So loads of questions, a lot of very valuable work going on, but as somebody who has engaged in policy, I still think there's lots of work for researchers to do, and I would plead for maintaining that multidimensionality and not being too reductive in wellbeing policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Richard. I need to introduce Richard, but then does he really need an introduction? He's an emeritus professor of economics at the London School of Economics, where he founded the Centre for Economic Performance, where he still leads the Wellbeing Programme. He's a member of the House of Lords and has weighed in on important policy debates over the years. He's known for his best-selling books and being a founding editor, co-editor of the World Happiness Report, co-founder of Action for Happiness, and of the World Wellbeing Movement, which gets launched this afternoon. And Rich is obviously co-organizing this conference, and I'm so very pleased to hand the floor to him.
Well, as Diane said, this is the second time we've done this. And I think I've been told I've got 6 minutes, so I've got 6 points. So the first point is the essential need for an overarching criterion. Because if you have a dashboard and you're trying to choose between two alternatives, and one is better on one bit of the dashboard and one is better on the other, you've got to have some idea about how important the different elements in the dashboard are. Where do you get that idea from? It's got to come from some estimate of how they contribute to the one thing which is really important. And unless you have an overarching concept, you can't really have a system of coherent decisions. As you said, you sort of, science stops when you've calculated the outcome in terms of dashboards, and then you get judgment, and there's no scientific way of carrying the discussion forward. So if you need an overarching criterion to weight the dashboards, why not just use the overarching criterion as the thing you're focusing on? But what should that be, second? The argument that has always impressed me is this, that there are many goods. I mean, they might be in the dashboard. You know, there's wealth, there's health, freedom, and so on. And you can ask people, why is that good? And they can give some sort of answer. They'll say, well, health is important. You feel awful if you're sick. Wealth is important. You feel better if you can do more things. But if you ask, why does it matter how people feel? You can't give an answer. I mean, that's the end of the tracks. That's the thing which is self-evident. And that's why that is the right concept of the overarching criterion. Then there's a question of how to measure that. Probably our debate. And the two basic ways are obviously to ask people how they feel about their life nowadays. We've had this discussion yesterday, so I'll just be quick. How do they feel about their life nowadays is the life satisfaction approach. The other is, how do they feel? Period. How are they feeling at this moment, that moment, cumulatively through time, which is the hedonic approach. I think that for most purposes, but not all, we should certainly start from the life satisfaction approach. I'll just give 3 reasons. Danny gave very interesting reflections on this yesterday. But first, I think there's a simple cheapness. I mean, if you can get a lot of information about a person's underlying state over a period of time from one question, that is a terrific advantage. Not only that, but the public can understand what the question is. They can answer it. Incidentally, these answers that they give to these questions are very quick in these questionnaires. Life satisfaction question is answered really quickly. People know. They know how they feel, and they know what the question means, and they would not be surprised to find it being used to analyse policy. Second, looking at it from the policymakers' point of view, and policymakers have actually for years been asking people, how satisfied are you with your swimming pools, with your roads, etc., with your garbage? It's not so far to go from that. Or how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? So that is why this approach appeals to policymakers, and we should, of course, want to do that if we possibly could. And then third, there are all the arguments that Danny brought up yesterday. How much weight do people give to their recollections of things? I would put it a bit more, how much weight do they give to really their underlying state of mind? Just kind of kind of the baseline. Of course, they're going up and down all the time during the day, according to what they're doing. Very interesting, should influence, obviously, what they make choices of. But the real thing is the underlying state of mind. Of course, we're very interested in, do we want people to take more exercise or all sorts of things, experiences, should we be putting on the Olympic Games, and so on. And, you know, we're not going to pick up the influence of that by asking people before and after the Olympic Games how satisfied they are with their lives. We've got to find out exactly how it affects their hedonic experience. But then we obviously have to have some set of coefficients for, in the end, converting the hedonic into the life satisfaction so that we can get a single overarching measure at the end of the day. I've not mentioned, this is my fourth point, the Aristotelian approach. There are quite a lot of people, Gus isn't here now, but probably quite a few people in this room who like to think of themselves as Aristotelians. It actually sounds rather good, doesn't it? It sounds sort of wiser than saying we want people to feel good about their lives. Somehow, eudaimonia, I mean, that sounds really good. I mean, it actually appeals to people for different reasons. Some people it appeals to because they think people should feel good about what they're doing. Well, that's not so different from feeling good about your life, to be perfectly honest, which is one reason why their answers are highly correlated. But I think actually the people, I think probably cover Gus, who like to use the Aristotelian approach is because it includes virtue. Now, I think that's a confusion of means with ends. And virtue is, of course, incredibly important. That's what we most want, because virtue means helping to create happiness for other people. So I won't go on about this anymore, because there's a forthcoming article in the World Happiness Report 2023 on this subject. But I don't think that's a helpful contender in terms of the final outcomes. It's more of a discussion of how do we get there. Of course, we want people to be great-hearted and virtuous and all those things. I think I've got two more points, yes. So, the outcome is life satisfaction. How would we therefore analyse all the different policies coming into the Treasury or whatever the decision maker is? We should obviously judge them by the amount of well-being which they generate per pound of expenditure. And this is a huge challenge to us researchers, to generate the information base which would make that possible. I remember the excitement 30 years ago. Tony Atkinson at LSE did a model which would show how a change in government policy would influence the distribution of income. We need a model now which shows how a change in government policy will change the distribution of well-being, and then evaluate that against the cost, make that the centre of cost-effectiveness analysis. But the research base is really important, and we're always hoping somebody would come forward and make a large-scale attack on this problem possible. So my last point, sustainability, very important, and social justice, just a word on each. Of course, all policies have effects over time. So both the outcome, the well-being outcome, and the costs have to be estimated over time and then collected together into a single number, each of them. the well-being approach says, I think, that everybody is equally important, wherever they live, wherever they live, but in this case, whenever they live. And that is really the reason why we should be pursuing sustainability, because we care about future generations as much as ourselves, or almost as much. We're not quite sure about the future, so we have to have some small discount rate, but not the kind of discount rate that's typically used in economic analysis. So I think it's no accident that the well-being fraternity and the sustainability fraternity have a massive overlap, because there's a huge common element which is a philosophy which says that people matter in the future just about as much as now. Social justice. I agree with Danny that relief of misery is more important than the extension of substantial happiness of by the same amount. And I think that this is an issue, that has to be left in the end to the judgment of the policymaker. And some people will be more concerned with eliminating misery than others. We can do it numerically. If they tell us what their weights are, we can apply their weights to changes in well-being starting from different points. And that's really what we have to do. People talk as though this is a problem for the well-being approach. I mean, this is a problem for life. It's a problem for every single approach. This has nothing to do with an argument against the well-being approach. We've got to find a way of incorporating the policymakers' distributional judgments. That has to be done with any known approach. So just in conclusion, it seems to me that the case for the well-being approach is not that we know exactly how to do everything and that there are no problems. Of course there are problems. The case for it is that there are less problems than with any other approach. That seems to me, we should be humble, and that's how we should make the case. If people are criticising this approach, don't let's say it's easy, but do let's say, you tell me your approach and show me that it's easier.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Paul, over to you. For those, Paul also needs very little introduction. He's a professor of behavioural science at the London School of Economics, where he founded the Department of Behavioural and Psychological Science. He was one of the driving forces way back already behind quality adjusted life years, and the 4 ONS measures in which he had a hand as well. You might also know him from his popular books on happiness, and especially the bestseller Happiness by Design. Paul, your take on subjective well-being as a criterion?
Yeah, thank you, Jan. So, first of all, I just want to say a few high-level contextual points, which is that we're all broadly in agreement that we should be measuring subjective well-being, and that we should be doing that in a way to inform policy decisions, and ideally with a single index measure. And I think that's important when we're having discussions with policymakers and with the outside world. We're all very much aligned. It was like a family. On the outside, we'll be united. Now I feel like a family where I've got all the siblings in the room who all favour one measure, even Danny, who used to be on my side, the traitor. And now I feel lonely and isolated as being the only family member, by and large, who would make a case for using experiential measures. But I do want to make that really important point at the start, though, which is that actually much of the time it won't matter. Much of the time, for the purposes of informing policy decisions, life satisfaction and experiential measures will be aligned. And for the purposes of us having discussions with the policymakers, the first order condition is for us to get them to take subjective wellbeing measures more seriously. So, having said all of that, I'm now going to feel very lonely. And I'm looking, look, you're sitting there, your arms folded right in front of me, Danny, making me very nervous. So what I thought I might do is frame it in a way that you can't possibly argue with, and that's make it about me. So I'll make it about my personal experiences. And in the start of Happiness by Design, which you mentioned, I talk a lot about having had a stammer, and I still have one. It doesn't manifest itself very often now, but it was debilitating. I can't impress upon you how awful an experience as a young boy, as a young adult, stammering was for me. Every time I had to do public speaking, or say my name even, saying my name, Paul Dolan, I can remember as a 12-year-old boy, I don't know, whether 14-year-old boy or something, saying my name over and over and over again, thousands of times in order to be able to say it without stammering. Now, if you ask me a life sat question, my life satisfaction throughout all of my childhood, all of my early life, always is, been pretty high. Always about an 8 or 9 out of 10. You shouldn't trust a 10 out of 10s. But my affective states were pretty miserable much of the time. And it seems to me that when they come apart, when life satisfaction, this is what I really want to focus on, when they come apart, not when they align, but when life satisfaction and experiences come apart, where should the policy interventions be directed? That for me is the question. That's the important framing of the question. And I'd like you all to think about that. No one has the answer to that question, but I think the answer to that question is that we would be focusing on misery. And I've heard misery mentioned, I've heard feelings mentioned. That is the essence of our life. They are the essence of our lives, how we feel, the things that we pay attention to as we go about our lives. Now, of course, life satisfaction measures draw attention to something when you answer them. Actually, not very much, frankly, because people answer them in, 2 seconds, so probably not very much that they're thinking about. But insofar as they are thinking about anything, the question is, are they thinking about what they're going to be paying attention to in the experiences of their lives that really matter as they live and breathe those lives? And sometimes they will, but oftentimes they won't. And I'll tell you just a quick story about someone else that many of you would have read in Happiness by Design, because it was the one story that actually many people picked up on. It was the story of my wife's best friend who worked for a broadcasting corporation in the UK with 3 letters. And we went for dinner, and she spent the whole of the evening complaining about every single aspect of her experience on the job. Her colleagues, her boss, her commute, everything about it was miserable. And then she stood up at the end of dinner and without any hint of irony said, you know, I love working at the Media Land. And she wasn't lying. What she was doing was drawing on different conceptions of her own happiness. The story that she was telling herself about working there was that she was happy. It's somewhere she'd always wanted to work. Her parents were proud. Her friends were jealous. She was satisfying a lot of her desires, and she was maximising, to some degree, life satisfaction. But she was fucking miserable. So I would contend, normatively, she's made a mistake. And actually, as I was making the point yesterday, partly what motivated me to get into this kind of area of work was the fact that the standard preference-based measures of measuring welfare were a poor guide to policy because people are not very good at being able to predict their future well-being. And in some ways, to some degree, life satisfaction measures are like that. They allow people to express the degree to which they're satisfied with their preferences even. And it's at least worth us inquiring properly and fully and robustly into the experiences that people have, particularly when they come apart. And for the purposes of guiding policy decisions, I would be arguing for minimising suffering as people live and breathe and experience it, and not as they evaluate it.
Thank you, Paul. Wow. This panel has already lived up to the high expectations and well beyond them so far. Quick follow-up on what Paul just said. Richard, how do you marry those instances where the experience does not necessarily match the evaluation of it? So Paul's wife's friend who works at Media Land with 3 letters, how would you take that into account if policy making needs to be done?
I think this goes back exactly to what Danny was saying. So, most people are least happy when they're working. But people without work are very unhappy. Mm-hmm. So what's work doing for people? I mean, don't you? I feel good when I've finished my work. Not while I'm working, I feel good when I've finished it, I've done it. So this is the problem, that so much of what you do influences your mood at other times from when you're doing it. This is the fundamental difficulty in this time use way of going at it, rather than trying to find out what is determining the person's sort of base level feeling. Of course, it goes over into their working time as well as other, but work influences, I mean, more of your life is not working than working. Your work has more of an influence in total utils on how you feel in your non-work time than it does in your work time. So this is why I think, and you know, the emphasis you've given to purpose, which is also there, is very important. The purpose is something that's kind of always with you, whatever you're doing, and I think it's you pick it up quite well in the life satisfaction question, and there's actually quite a lot of feeling in the way people answer life satisfaction, and we call it life evaluation. That sounds very cerebral, but it's actually a better way of describing how do you feel about your life, which is the sort of feeling.
Yeah, no, just again, just to say what I said at the beginning, because I think that's really important. Much of the time the measures will align, and especially in work, people that will often have high life satisfaction in work will also have good experiences in work. But it is, as you absolutely rightly say, it's important to draw attention to experiences of purpose alongside those of pleasure. And of course, that's where many people get most of their purposes through work. But it does then lead us into considerations of where the interventions will be directed to have the most effect. And many of you that will know the worker wellbeing literature better than I do, generally speaking, pleasure-based activities or interventions are not ones that are particularly good for worker wellbeing, but purpose-based ones are. And so understanding that distinction in the experiences that people have in work is fundamentally important. And the life satisfaction measures will again potentially combine or even conflate pleasure and purpose in ways that are not useful for people in workplaces thinking about interventions.
From a pragmatic perspective, you do want policymakers to have a criterion and not have to measure pleasure, purpose, or some weighted average between them, and it doesn't. Life satisfaction captures both to some extent.
Answer the multidimensionality point.
I would disagree with that, and this is a rerun of the debate we've had for a long time. I don't think you need an overarching criterion, actually. And let me talk about the way we reach these decisions in the context of BBC services. I will say the three letters. There was a framework, it was called Public Value Test, and it had 4 criteria. So it was a 4-item dashboard. How many people would use the service, what's the cost efficiency of it, what's the technical quality of it, and what's the impact likely to be in terms of its stated aim. And we would set out the evidence and actually reach a judgment on that framework. There was no need at all to boil it down to a single overarching criterion. And I think that role for judgment is important because you won't always want to weight things together in the same way. And there are things that we would care about that may be completely incommensurable. So a sense of identity or cultural identification or pride in place is a different kind of beast from the satisfaction that you get from everyday life and your life and work. So I wouldn't want to reduce those. Sense of purpose, another example. And the final thing to add is I would say that from what I've seen, agency or control seems to be important, and that isn't an outcome, it's about the process. And do you want to collapse that into how people feel in terms of either measure of life satisfaction or evaluation? I think not. I think it's just a different kind of criterion, and we should allow judgment.
Diane, allow me to push back a little bit. Take your own example, the BBC, 4 dimensions or 4 outcomes that you're measuring that are really critical in a dashboard approach. If you're the CEO of the BBC and you have a limited budget, say 100 million to spend, how do you decide which of these 4 to invest in? Do you then invest 25 million in each one of these 4 dimensions? Because you don't have a criterion to optimize on, so you wouldn't necessarily know the relative importance of these 4 dimensions in driving the whole outcome of which there's no measure.
Well, then you see how they tally against your strategic aims, which in the BBC's case is set out in the Charter. This was the revision to the Green Book a couple of years ago. The evaluation criteria did not change. It was still the same cost-benefit analysis, taking in wider welfare effects, taking in well-being effects. But an additional consideration would be to what extent did the outcome of the exercise tie in with the government's overarching ambition to level up the economy. It might not be economically efficient to level up the economy.
But what you just said, is that not referring to implicitly a criterion? The overarching ambition of the government is your criterion on which to base your spending across the
But that's judgmental, and a different government can have a different one.
Okay.
Sorry, could I just... the Green Book now says social well-being is the objective. In practice, most of it is to be evaluated in monetary units based on revealed preference, but they're now allowing for the use, somebody else will be saying this later, they're allowing for the use of direct measures and showing how that can be done. But I mean, so that, of course, has an overarching criterion. And why that's so important is, I mean, David and I have spent, I don't know how long now, God knows, nearly 18 years, trying to get more money for mental health. And we're told there isn't money. Well, there is money. Where is it going? Where is this money going at the moment? Under the previous Prime Minister, if we have to call him, it's going into physical infrastructure, building roads, building railways. I mean, if we want a serious argument about getting the right kind of things that you would support for mental health, we've got to be able to say what's going to be less of, as well as what's going to be more of, and we've got to be able to do that on a single criterion. So, I mean, that's why we can't just minimise misery, because there must be some reason why we have a transport system for the lives of ordinary people, and there's some reason why we have an education system for the lives of ordinary people. We've got to be able to balance reasonable levels of expenditure on those things against misery reduction, and that requires some overarching criterion.
You can tell this panel is very passionate about these elements and has eaten up in quite a bit of time, but we should try and get at least 1 or 2 questions from the audience, expert audience, I should say.
I think part of this is a marketing issue as well as a measurement issue. I mean, John, you called it the World Happiness Report. You don't call it the World Life Satisfaction Report. Satisfaction is a really dull word to go to the public with. It's not inspiring. You know, care that Joe talked about this morning. Suddenly people start to rise when we start using emotional words in this space. You talk about happiness, and now I don't think the Cantrell ladder of life is necessarily happiness. It doesn't feel affect-based. And so there's the measurement issues, but there's also, if we really want to make a public movement about this, we need the vision thing. We need the vision thing, and I think that we need words that have got more emotion in them. And I don't know, that's what I just say. I mean, that's why I called it the Happy Planet Index. My first name for it was Sustainable Wellbeing Index. Luckily, someone got hold of me and went, call it the Happy Planet. There's no way it would have been as successful if it been called the Sustainable Wellbeing Index. So it's partly about marketing. I just want to point that out there, that we're going to persuade people.
Mm-hmm. Mark.
Mostly Diane's comments about whether we need single criteria, maybe sort of at the end of the day, but what about kind of in a more day-to-day way in public policy? So I work a lot in the social services area, in multiple complex disadvantage. This is like a multi-decade running problem, super hard to solve, and usually you make kind of very small incremental steps that feel like you're moving in the right direction, but almost every policy fails. And so what we're trying to do is learn things about very many issues that we might be interested in, like how does mental health relate to drug abuse, relate to housing, relate to whatever, and we're trying to collect information on all these different things. If we base our decisions about which of these social projects is most effective in terms of a final outcome, then we don't learn very much about the process that is achieving that final outcome. And I wonder if there's any worries that in focusing on one key overarching variable, we fail to collect all this other information that we need to understand the causation to get to that final variable.
Can I build on Mark's point and perhaps also conclude with a consensus proposal, or at least to get your feedback on it? The OECD has a Better Lives Index. It's 11 dimensions. Most of you will be very familiar with it. There's 10 dimensions that are your traditional drivers, pathways to, causal avenues towards well-being more generally. And then there's that 11th dimension, which is feeling, subjective well-being. In fact, it uses the Cantor ladder from the Gallup World Poll, which we use for the World Happiness Report. Is that a step forward from when moving beyond GDP to adopt something like the OECD Better Life Index, have these 11 dimensions, which then allow people with their own tastes and tweaks to either use the 11 dimensions together in an index, which the OECD proposes, or people that prefer the subject well-being as an overarching criterion for a number of reasons, to then leverage that 11th dimension and put it sort of on top in the analysis to have something on the left-hand side of the equation and help be explained by variables on the right hand of the equation that Mark is referring to. So I was wondering, Diane, Richard, Paul, how do you feel about the OECD 11 dimensions that have the subjective element, the objective element, and potentially allow that flexibility for us to move forward?
I'm going to cop out and say I don't think we know enough yet about the causal mechanisms that Mark is referring to make a final decision. So I welcome the Better Life Index, of course, but I don't have a horse in the race. I'm going to cop out.
Richard, how do you feel about the Better Life Index and its potential?
Well, I think it's a step forward, but it's not a big enough step forward, and in some sense, it actually, 11 is not broken down enough. I mean, what bits of education or whatever. But am I allowed to answer Nick's question at the same time?
Go for it, Richard. I
mean, Nick's raised an incredibly important question, and I gather that various people have been discussing this over coffee already. But it is quite an important thing for this group, and indeed the name of this conference is the Wellbeing Conference. We many of us started off with the word happiness. I think you've always used the word happiness. So how did we get to well-being? Well, it was partly this Aristotelian thing that I mentioned before. But it's also extraordinary confusions about language. People think that if you're talking about happiness, it means you're either happy or not happy. They think it's binary. Then they think, well, you can't be happy that much of the time, so it's a ridiculous objective. Somehow they have picked up the idea, because well-being is not really part of the English language, that well-being is a scale, whereas happiness is not a scale. I mean, if we could get people to think of happiness as a scale, we could possibly get back to happiness. And that would be a very much better situation, because happiness is really not frivolous. It is not frivolous to ask somebody if a child is happy at school. It is not frivolous to ask somebody if they are happy at work or if they are happily married. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that we need to conduct this linguistic argument in public.
Thank you. And on behalf of all of us.
Get a moment or not? Do I not get to say the final word since we all had a go? Can we have a little go? Because what I was going to do was actually agree wholeheartedly with that, because you have to get the subjective into discourse as a serious metric. It's all subjective is actually the whole point of it.
And
but I was going to say, on your OECD Better Life Index, which was your question to all of us, I'll just remind you of that, was that I was thinking about two people that I really care about a lot, which are my two teenage children, more than probably anybody else that I care about. Would I want that metric to be used as a way of measuring how well their lives are going? Maybe, but I'd want to know how they're feeling.
And that's why for people like Richard and Paul, the 11th dimension, how they feel, can be put on top.
How they feel, how they feel, not the Cantrell ladder.
I see.
Yeah, let's be clear about that. Let's be absolutely
clear. My hope for resolving all these issues after all these years is completely gone up in smoke at this point. But please join me in thanking all three.